Well, we are going to conclude our study of Matthew chapter 15 this morning with a look at the feeding of the 4,000. And it's, as we look through the miracles of Jesus, as you think about the miracles of Jesus, it's doubtful that any miracle of our Lord is more overlooked than this one, the feeding of the 4,000. Most commentators, when they come to the commentary on this, just kind of point back to the feeding of the 5,000 and say the lessons are about the same, and then they move forward. Some, over the last several decades, have even pushed to say that this was just a retelling of the same event, and that Matthew got something mixed up and just repeated this miracle because they are so similar. But as we're going to look at over the course of this morning, there is quite a bit of difference between the two. Though some of the lessons are very similar, we see there is enough differences worth noting in studying this miracle, and so that's what we're going to do this morning, especially as we look at the overall theme of chapter 15 and the ministry of Jesus to the Gentiles. We see that this miracle actually marks the end of another portion of Jesus' ministry and makes a very important statement. So we'll begin this morning by reading our text, Matthew chapter 15, verses 29 to 39. Departing from there, Jesus went along by the Sea of Galilee, and having gone up to the mountain, he was sitting there, and large crowds came to him, bringing with them those who were lame, crippled, blind, mute, and many others. And they laid them down at his feet, and he healed them. So the crowd marveled as they saw the mute speaking, the crippled restored, the lame walking, and the blind seeing, and they glorified the God of Israel. And Jesus called his disciples to him and said, I feel compassion for the people because they have remained with me now 3 days and have nothing to eat. And I do not want to send them away hungry, for they might faint on the way. The disciples said to him, Where would we get so many loaves in this desolate place to satisfy such a large crowd? And Jesus said to them, How many loaves do you have? And they said, 7, and a few small fish. And he directed the people to sit down on the ground, and he took 7 loaves and the fish, and giving thanks, he broke them and started giving them to the disciples. And the disciples gave them to the people. And they all ate and were satisfied. And they picked up what was left over of the broken pieces, 7 large baskets full. And those who ate were 4,000 men, besides women and children. And sending away the crowds, Jesus got into the boat and came to the region of Magadan. So we do see some similarities between this section and what we read back in chapter 14 with the reading of the 5,000. But there are enough differences here that it's worth taking time to study this miracle and this section. And it begins by understanding, again, the scene, what's going on around Jesus. Some of the things that Matthew doesn't actually tell us, but we read in the other Gospels, especially in the Gospel of Mark. We begin this section with Jesus returning from the area of Tyre and Sidon. And if you remember last week, that is where Jesus had gone to and was trying to get away from the crowds, trying to get away from the pressure that was being put on him by both the people of Israel, the Jewish people, and trying to make him their king, and also the political and religious pressure that was trying to shut him down, coming from both Herod and the Jewish religious leaders. And after he had spent several months in the area of Tyre and Sidon, he returned to the area of Galilee, but not to the Jewish region, but rather to, as we read in the Gospel of Mark, to the area of the Decapolis. That is a Greek term referring to 10 different cities that were largely Greek or Gentile cities. And he was going there largely for the same reason he had left for Tyre and Sidon to begin with, in order to get away from the crowds, in order to avoid the confrontation that he continually had with the Jewish leaders, so that he could focus his time in his ministry training the 12 disciples, getting them ready for the ministry that they would have after he was crucified and then raised and ascending into heaven. This is on the opposite side of the Sea of Galilee from the feeding of the 5,000 that happened several months before. And though Matthew doesn't give us a time frame, we know that there is a difference. We know that several months have passed, because in the feeding of the 5,000, Matthew makes it clear that the people were sat down on the grass, where in this event, in the feeding of the 4,000, they sat down on what he essentially calls the dirt, or the stony ground. In the area around Galilee, the grass only grows openly for the first month or two in the beginning of spring when the heavy rains come, and after that the scorching heat tends to dry them out. And so this is, at least we know, 2 to 3 months difference from the feeding of the 5,000. We also see that he heads up to a mountain, and an area that would have been away from the 10 cities in and of themselves, getting away from any large center of civilization, so that he can be away again to focus on teaching his disciples. And he sat up on this mountain, but was immediately followed by crowds of people who began to flow in over the course of several days. We see there that he mentions in verse 32 that they were there for at least 3 days. And some of the people who may have saw him come through the area, reaching the Sea of Galilee, would have recognized him and began to follow him, and had been there on the side of the mountain in the scorching heat for the last 3 days, having little or nothing to eat with them. And of course, as he came through the area, word would spread about his presence, and people from miles around would begin seeking him out because of his miracles that he had been doing all over the area of Galilee, coming to him with all those who were lame and crippled and blind and dumb. And of course, if you are taking someone who is in that state, it's going to take you even longer to travel. And so over the course of 3 days, this crowd continues to grow as all those who are sick or lame in some way are brought to him. Crowds growing to the point of reaching 4,000 men. And as we talked about in the feeding of the 5,000, that's just taking into account the men who were there, not the women and the children, recognizing that that crowd would likely have reached upwards of around 20,000 at least. And we see again in verse 29 that all the crowds were full of people seeking after healings, all of them being laid at his feet. The first lesson that we can take from this section, one that we have seen before but is worth mentioning again, is that the healings of Jesus were unique. The healing of Jesus and his disciples were unique and were completely unfakeable. Matthew was very intentional with the words he chose to describe those looking for healing. He did not simply say those who were sick or lame in some way, but specifically mentions 4 words that give us a picture of the type of healings that Jesus was doing here. The first is the word lame, and that refers to someone who is paralyzed. A limb or a body part that has no feeling or use, particularly referring to someone who would have no use of their legs. It was the same word that he used of the paralytic who was lowered through the roof. Someone who has no use of their lower body parts, whether it be through an accident or birth or a stroke, something like that. The second word that he uses here is the word crippled. And this refers to someone whose body part, either an arm or a leg, is maimed to the point of being unusable, or more to the point is often used as a body part that has been amputated. Oftentimes in the ancient world, if there was a cut or a wound bad enough, especially on an appendage, because of the likelihood of infection, oftentimes those limbs had to be amputated in order to keep the infection from spreading throughout the rest of the body. And so Jesus was not only allowing those who had been paralyzed to walk, he was bringing in new body parts. He was creating out of nothing new body parts for people who had lost an arm or a leg. We also see that he was healing those who were blind. Again, blindness was a common malady because of the lack of medical care and understanding at the time. Eyes could be put out, and often were put out, as punishment for different crimes, or especially amongst the Roman soldiers, was used as a way of punishing criminals or insurrectionists. And the last thing we see here, those who were dumb. And this often refers to one who is either deaf or mute, as the two tend to go hand in hand. We might be a little bit more accustomed to now those who are born deaf being taught how to speak, either through sign language or through learning how to read someone's mouth movements and reach the point where they can also form words, those who are born deaf. But at the time there was no such way of helping people to communicate if they were deaf or mute. What we see in this, and what we can take away from this, is that those who claim the ability to heal today have no way of recreating the kind of miracles that Jesus did in his healings. If you go to any of the supposed faith healers today, what you will often see is supposed healings of maladies that are not visible to the human eye, whether it be issues of migraines or back pain or cancer, whatever it might be. It's always invisible to the crowd who is watching. You will never see at these faith healers anyone come to the stage who has an obvious deformity of the body. You'll never see someone come to the stage, a person missing a leg or an arm or an eye. And though there might be some unexplainable events going on with these so-called faith healers, a lot of these can be attributed to the placebo effect, or mind tricks that people, simply out of the power of belief or being able to push their bodies to the limits, might be able to overcome the pain that they normally feel, might be able to place it out of their mind to do something they wouldn't otherwise be able to do. Some of these even having lasting effects. But again, what you will never see is one of these faith healers bringing a leg or creating a leg when there was no leg, or remaking an arm when there was no arm, or giving someone sight who had nothing but empty eye sockets. The kind of healing that these faith healers claim is nothing compared to the kind of healing that Jesus was doing. Their supposed healings will never be creative in nature. And that is a standard of healing set by Christ and his apostles in the New Testament. Now, I do believe that God does heal, but he does not heal in this way. He doesn't heal in miraculous ways like this, like we see in this section. The kind of healing that Jesus and his apostles did was unique in history, and they were done in order to authenticate the revelation that he was giving. The New Age prophets and healers that we see in our world today often claim new revelation, new words from God, but they can never substantiate their claims with the kind of miracles that Jesus and the apostles were doing. The kind of miracles that Scripture lays out as true miracles given to authenticate these sort of things. And so we need to be careful when we look at supposed miraculous healings today and see, are they creative in nature? And I say creative in the sense of bringing something that was not there. The second lesson that we can see in this section is the universal compassion and power of Christ. We'll start with the aspect of the universal nature of his compassion. And again, though he had left Tyre and Sidon, he was still very much in a Gentile area. Jesus was, throughout all of chapter 15, what Matthew was laying out clearly is that Jesus was showing a picture of the kingdom of God that was to come. Not only was it a kingdom of God in which suffering and sickness would be banished, and that there would be provision for all those who had need, but it is also a picture of its universal scope. That is the focus of all of chapter 15. In verses 1 to 20, in rejecting the exclusive, Jesus in confronting the Jews about their traditions, was rejecting in part the traditionalism and the exclusivism that was a part of that religion. In declaring all foods, as Mark makes it clear, and declaring all foods clean, that which enters the body does not defile a person. It is that which exits the heart or the mouth that defiles a person. Jesus was making all foods clean, and by extension, he was making all Gentiles, all Greeks, all people outside of the Jewish race also clean and able to come and meet with God, something that would be made abundantly clear in Acts chapter 10 with Peter's vision. But that's just the beginning. We see then the interaction in verses 21 to 28 that we looked at last week, showing us the marvelous contrast between the shallowness, the resistance and the rejection, the bitter hatred and the spiritual pride of the Jews, and giving to us an example of great faith with genuine hunger and humility coming from a Gentile woman. Again, some critics of the Bible have claimed that the feeding of the 5,000 and the feeding of the 4,000 are just jumbled retellings of the same event. But when we see this clear theme in chapter 15, we can see the distinction that Matthew is laying out for us. In fact, one commentator has made it clear that Jesus ends each period of his ministry with a feeding. He began by ending his ministry to the Jews at large with the feeding of the 5,000. He then ends his ministry focused on the Gentiles that went from his period of several months up in Tyre and Sidon, and now this ministry here to the Gentiles, the feeding of the 4,000. And we'll see in time, he ends his ministry to his apostles with the Last Supper and the issuance of communion. Again, this provision being universal in scope, because we see not only was Jesus providing the miracles to the Jewish people as he had been for the previous 2 years, healing the sick and healing the lame, but he had also fed the people of Israel. And now he's showing the universality of his ministry by providing the same sort of healing for the Gentiles in the area. And now with the feeding of the 4,000 showing the provision for the Gentiles. And it is important to recognize that this area, the Decapolis, was an area marked by the worship of the Greek gods. There have been, over the course of the last number of years, many temples and shrines discovered in that area from the time of Christ that were built to the Greek gods, to gods like Zeus and Poseidon, and especially Athena and Artemis. So these would have been very Greek people in language and in culture, if not in heritage as well. And because of that, they would have been rejected by their Jewish neighbors and would likely have been not very acquainted with the Jewish writings, what we know as the Old Testament. But nothing could keep them from recognizing who Jesus was and what he was able to do. because his miracles and his abilities were spreading all throughout the area. And that's why when Jesus came to town, everyone went out into the wilderness, up onto this mountain, to see this miracle worker, to bring their sick and their lame, hoping for a healing. And when they did, what Mark tells us in chapter 7, in his account of this event, that they were utterly astonished. In verse 31 of our section here in Matthew, we read that the crowds marveled at what they saw, and that they glorified the God of Israel. Not only did God perform all of these miracles in front of these Gentiles, who, according to the Jewish people, a group who were cut off from God, unable to be close to Him, unable to come to Him, unable to have salvation. Not only was Jesus performing these miracles in front of them, but God had opened their eyes to the truth of Jesus' power, that His miraculous ability came from Him, the God of Israel. Something that throughout the last several chapters of Matthew we have seen the Jewish people themselves rejected, accusing Jesus not of having power coming from God, but rather from Satan. We also see the compassion of Christ in this miracle. In verse 32, Jesus said to His disciple, "I feel compassion for the people, because they have remained with me now for 3 days and have nothing to eat. And I do not want to send them away hungry, for they might faint on the way." Again, these people had been out in the wilderness, away from cities. Unlike most events today that you might go out into a field, there were no vendors, no stalls, no way of buying food from people who could bring it out on carts or on trucks. Though there may have been some who brought food with them for the first day, they ended up staying multiple days, sleeping out under the stars just to continue to watch all that Jesus was doing and to hear His teaching, and then had been with Him now for 3 days. It's worth noting that though they had been out there for 3 days, even not eating, even going hungry for these extra couple of days was not enough to tear them away from Jesus. And yet we see so many of those of the Jewish people walking away from Him at the slightest difficulty. Now, it was only 3 days, and so we know that they weren't going to die. If you think to the rule of threes in human survival, people can go about 3 minutes without air, 3 days without water, and about 3 weeks without food. They weren't going to die for not eating over the course of 2 days. In fact, many of them were probably accustomed to going several days without eating, and difficult times, very much of the regular life of these people would be eating hand to mouth, making their money for that day, purchasing food and eating, and oftentimes that meant going a day or two without eating if things were a little bit scarce. So they would have been accustomed to not eating, and yet Jesus still has compassion on these people. But we also read that He goes beyond just the healing. He goes beyond just providing a simple meal, just enough to sustain them. Jesus says here He does not want them to go home and faint on the way home. And so He feeds them. In verse 37 we read, "And they all ate and were satisfied." Again, this is the same word that we saw in the feeding of the 5,000. This doesn't mean that they satiated their hunger, that they just felt their bellies weren't a little less empty, but rather they were stuffed. It has the idea of pigs or cattle eating from a feed trough, lapping it up to the point where they can't eat anymore. Jesus didn't just provide a simple meal, but rather He provided a feast. So much so that there were 7, it says, baskets full, but these were not the same kind of baskets from the feeding of the 5,000, these were the Greek baskets. There's the word here is different from the feeding of the 5,000. When there were 12 baskets left over, in that case, the baskets that the Jews would have carried with them were more like a lunch bag or a knapsack that they could have held just a day or two's worth of rations in. Rather, this word refers to more of the Greek basket, something a large, almost what we might think of as a hamper. And so there is quite a bit left over, far beyond just the basic food for the disciples. Now there is an abundance that is left over. The third lesson that we can see in this is that the point of ministry, the point of any sort of ministry, whether it is a mercy or compassion ministry, is always to bring people to worship and to worship God. Jesus did not minister to the needs of his people just to meet their needs. He wasn't there just to make their lives a little bit better. And that is never the point of our ministry when we reach out to those who are in need, whether it be our next door neighbors or around the world. We minister to them not just to make their lives a little bit better for the here and now, but so that they will come to learn about God and to glorify Him. Evangelism is the same. It is never meant to bring people to see what they can get from God. Evangelism should never be based on meeting people's needs, figuring out what they want, what would make their lives better, and showing them how God can do that, but rather it is to get them to the point where they will submit to God and begin to worship Him for who He is. The fourth lesson might be better split up into several smaller ones, but we're just going to call it the fourth lesson for now, and we'll break them up as we go through. But it is that Jesus always uses His disciples for ministry. Jesus always uses His disciples for ministry. In verse 33, He looks to His disciples and says to them, and essentially looks to them and says, how are we going to feed these people? And in the feeding of the 5,000, their response, Jesus essentially accuses them of having no faith because they didn't believe that there was any way of providing for these people. In verse 33, there is a similar response, but Jesus does not chide them. Here they say, where would we get so many loaves in this desolate place to satisfy such a large crowd? And I don't believe that this is another show of a lack of faith on the part of the disciples, again, because Jesus doesn't say anything about that lack of faith. Instead, what it is on the part of the disciples is a recognition of their inadequacy. They knew that Jesus could produce bread and fish out of nothing. They had seen Him do it before. And so the response was not so much one of a lack of faith, but simply a statement of, Lord, if you want us to feed them, we don't have any, we can't go get it, and so it's going to be up to you to provide the food again. And again, Jesus didn't need His disciples to feed the people. He didn't need to use them. He didn't need to go to them. He could have called down manna from heaven. This would have been something that the Jewish people would have understood as a miracle from God, manna coming down from heaven. Of course, as we think back to the Old Testament, to the Exodus, and God feeding His people in the wilderness for 40 years using this method. But Jesus looks to His disciples and says, how are we going to feed these people? And He uses them, as we see in verse 36. Jesus took the loaves and the fish, and He gave thanks and broke them and started giving them to the disciples. And the disciples gave them to the people. In the same way, God does not need to use His church to reach the world, to minister to the world. He can use any form, any system that he wished to reach these people. He could bring miracles, he could provide food out of nothing, but instead God has chosen to use his church on this earth both to minister to the needs and to minister the gospel to the world. It's something that often puzzles me as I look at how flawed the church truly is. But as we look at this truth, it is amazing to see how God does use such flawed people when he has other means at his disposal. It is such a heavy responsibility, and yet at the same time it is an amazing gift that God gives to his church. The responsibility of ministering to the world, of being his intercessors, being his kingdom of priests, taking his word and his love to the world. But as we can see, the next part of this ministry, God can only use us when we are fully dependent on his divine resources. Again, the disciples here, I don't think were acting in a lack of faith, but simply recognizing that they were incapable of fulfilling the ministry that Jesus had given to them, feeding this huge crowd of people. They were nowhere near a town. They had nowhere near the money they would need. And so in looking to him, this question in verse 33 was not a lack of faith, but again a recognition that they needed his divine resources in order to fill the ministry he had given to them. And this is something that we have seen over and over again. God receives the most glory when those who minister in his name recognize their true inability and their lack of resources on their own. When we realize that we have no ability to accomplish the task set before us with the resources and abilities that we possess, God is given the most glory. God has chosen to use the damaged and imperfect and sometimes useless tools in his church to take his word and his ministry to the world. And when he does that, he is the only one who can be glorified. And as we saw the same example looking at the 12 as we were studying through the book, 12 Ordinary Men, the only resource that we have available for sure is ourselves, our commitment to serve. And just as the 7 loaves and few fish were not nearly enough to accomplish the task that God had given the disciples, when we come to him recognizing that our abilities and our resources are not nearly enough, that is when he multiplies them to unimaginable ends. But again, that makes the only way that that is possible is when we make ourselves available to Christ. So often we see our inability, we see our lack of resources, and choose rather to just sit home and do nothing. We don't trust in God to provide those resources, and so the ministry is never accomplished. The work is never done. The last part of this lesson here is that we must always be willing to serve in whatever role God calls us to. We can see that in the response of the disciples. They immediately got up and began to serve, even though they were just working essentially as waiters, taking food from Jesus to the people. We can kind of see this from either angle. On the one hand, we could say that these were the 12, the privileged 12, the chosen apostles, the ones who had been sitting at the feet of Jesus and listening to his teaching, and God called them essentially to wait tables, to hand out food. And yet they responded immediately and did so. We must always remember to approach every ministry opportunity with that same humility, whether it's serving someone who is sick or hurt, bringing them a meal, or scrubbing the toilets in the church. On the other hand, we might see this from the bottom up. These were 12 very ordinary men whose training was far from complete, and they were being tasked to serve and minister to a crowd of thousands. I'm sure, as most of you have felt at some time or another, they were completely inadequate to the task, unprepared for what God was calling them to, serving in a role beyond what they thought they were capable of doing. And yet God so often does that, calls us to something that we might think is impossible. And as long as we make ourselves available, as long as we look to and depend upon His divine resources, God can take that little ability and turn it into an amazing response, turn it into an amazing gift of ministry to the world. So the question I'll end this sermon with is just that. Are you making yourself available? Are you making yourself available for whatever way God has laid out for you to minister?